Hello, it's Steve Smith here, and this is CP presentation number 23, which I've called Paying Attention. This stems from some reading and writing that I've been doing for a book I'm working on with Gianfranco Conti about cognitive science for language teachers. And I've done one already called Memory, if you look back through the channel and find that particular presentation. This one's about attention. So, what can I tell you that might be of interest to you? Well, first thing is, why do students forget what we teach them? And, a number of factors here come into play. And one of the key ones is that students, as we know, were not paying attention in the first place. So attention is the number one requirement. But it's also true that students might forget things if they don't actually process the information, encode it in their brains properly. They might just forget the information through natural decay, fading from memory. That can be fading from your working memory, your short-term memory, or your long-term memory. Sometimes they might not remember things because they've confused items together. One item has interfered with another. So, for example, in language learning, it might be that two words that sound similar. So in French, it could be the word cours, which can be spelt in different ways, could have two or three meanings at least. And interference between those might cause confusion with memory and loss of memory. And also something which is called cue-dependent forgetting, that's the technical term for it. It's when, for example, you learned something when certain cues were associated with that learning, and then when you try and retrieve the item from memory, you don't use the same cue, so you can't remember it. So forgetting happens for all sorts of reasons, but we're going to focus on this first one, paying attention. Now, in a book I've been reading just now by Stanislas Dehaene, who is a French cognitive scientist and writer, he talks of his 4 pillars of learning in his book, How We Learn. And his 4 pillars are those: focused attention, active engagement with what you're learning, error feedback, and what he calls daily rehearsal and nightly consolidation. I think you probably all know that rehearsal is important, practicing and spaced repetition. You will have heard of that before. You might not know so much that our brains learn a lot actually as we sleep. There's a process of consolidation which occurs during sleep, and that's why, for example, it's considered a good idea to revise material late at night and then sleep on it. Our brains actually are working really hard overnight and consolidating memories. Here's the brain science bit. If you have a look at the diagram on the right here, the part of the brain that's thought to be most engaged in attention and focusing on what you're trying to learn is the prefrontal cortex. If you remember, on the left-hand side of the brain, for most people, is where we process sounds and languages, and then on the right-hand side of the brain is where we focus on images and spatial awareness and so on. Although what's interesting is that the brain is highly adaptable. There are cases of, I'll give you one from the Stanislas Dehaene book, of a little boy who had his right hemisphere almost entirely removed at the age of 3. And yet, despite losing this part of the brain, which is responsible for sort of images and visual awareness and so on, he was able to learn to paint and draw and do other things because his left hemisphere took over the job gradually. So the brain is remarkably adaptable, actually. So if ever you think these things are very, very simple and that language is always on the left and that images are always on the right and so on, it's actually, I'm sure, a lot more complicated than that. But to talk about attention, what psychologists call executive attention, then, is where we use our prefrontal cortex to focus on a particular task or multiple tasks at hand. Some psychologists, it seems, believe that our long-term memory is also involved in executive attention in some models of memory. One little interesting fact is that children with ADHD have been shown to have reduced blood flow in their prefrontal cortex. So there are physical symptoms associated with lack of attention. So for those students you have in the class who are dreamy, easily distracted or distract others easily. That there is probably a physical reason for that. So it turns out that when it comes to attention span, the average person has an attention span of 40 minutes on average, depending on the complexity of the task. So that must be hugely variable. And if we don't pay attention to information, then it can't enter our working memory, our short-term memory at all. And if it can't enter working memory, then it can't pass into long-term memory, which is really where we want our knowledge to be. That's not taking into account, of course, with language learning, that much of our learning, particularly with first language learning, is implicit. It kind of happens without us necessarily paying attention to the form of the language. But even so, we have to be listening or reading to pick up language. So there's some attention involved. So when information goes into our working memory as we pay attention, then working memory is also really importantly able to bring in knowledge from long-term memory to make the working memory process information more efficiently. So the more information that you have in long-term memory, the easier it becomes for working memory to process new incoming language input. This is sometimes called the Matthew effect, i.e. the more you have already, the easier it is to acquire new information. So with our younger learners, our less experienced learners, they're using working memory a great deal to process information in real time, and then gradually, as they acquire more language over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then the process becomes easier and easier. So obviously one thing that interferes with attention greatly are distractions of any type. And research has shown that the mobile phone, even if it's not actually in front of you, even if it's nearby in a bag, can be a distraction. Background speech or music is a distraction. So if students ever ask, is it a good idea to listen to music when they're learning material? Well, on the whole, no, but especially music that has lyrics in your own language, in your native language, that's going to be a distraction. And generally speaking, it's best to revise in silence, but maybe some music in the background might create other feelings of relaxation, which could, I suppose, potentially help with learning. But in one study there that I've mentioned, students who revised in quiet environments performed more than 60% better in an exam than their peers who revised while listening to music with lyrics. So this has been researched. Now, when it comes to language acquisition, I've mentioned to you in a previous talk the Schmidt noticing hypothesis. The idea, which is very influential in language acquisition circles, that we do need to pay attention to the form of the language to help us acquire that language when we're learning a second language. So paying attention to the form of the language and noticing its form is thought to be crucial for input to become intake, i.e. language that we actually begin to process and therefore can potentially acquire, can potentially go to long-term memory. So the key features then of this noticing hypothesis are that attention is crucial. Secondly, that focal attention to the input is normally accompanied by quite a low level of awareness. So it might be that you're listening and paying attention, but not to a high degree of focus on the form of the language. But what is noticed can become intake. So you need some level of awareness, if you see what I mean. So if attention is so important, clearly a number of factors in the classroom come into play, and I suppose the number one has to be classroom behaviour. And I'm not going to go into that one here. It's a big issue, of course, in its own right, but behaviour needs to be good. Lessons need to be interesting for students, both in terms of content, is it actually inherently interesting, or maybe the delivery. And sometimes as language teachers we're forced to teach quite mundane material, linguistically mundane material, but if we can make the delivery interesting, then just the activity itself can make the material seem more interesting. And that's something that language teachers have to do quite a good deal, partly because the syllabus forces us to. So if you're having to teach some well-worn topic like daily routine or what I did last weekend, that's why as language teachers we try and find some interesting way of delivering something quite banal. Because actually that language is high frequency and it's important. So if we can find a way of delivering it more interestingly, then it becomes interesting in itself. Of course, there's all those generic teacher skills, which a writer like Doug Limoff describes so well in his book Teach Like a Champion. So the things that good teachers do instinctively well or can learn to do by deliberate practice, keeping eye contact, scanning the class, the way you use your body and voice, or your formative assessment techniques that you can use, moving around the classroom, approaching the child who looks like they might be just beginning to lose attention, so just bodily proximity, all these subtle techniques that you can bring in to your teaching will help with attention. Absolutely crucially for linguists is that language needs to be comprehensible. If you're using input which students don't understand, then very quickly they're going to switch off and lose attention. So that's why one of the reasons why the argument is always made for comprehensible input. It's true, games can have a very positive motivational impact. So there's no rule that says that language teachers have to use games all the time, but certainly they can have a very motivational impact and generate interest. Classroom layout's an interesting one because although there isn't really that much convincing research one way or the other favouring different types of layout, I kind of think that common sense comes into play, and the traditional view of, in most situations in secondary education, having students looking to the front, whether that be in rows or pairs or whatever it might be, I think is bound to affect a student's ability to pay attention. So if they're sitting on grouped tables, cabaret style, and having to crane their neck to see the board, that has the potential to be distracting, as well as, of course, the fact that they might be facing another student who might easily distract them as well. So for me, that's a pretty powerful reason to use rows. Of course, having students in rows doesn't stop you doing pair work and group work. It's very easy to turn sideways or turn round. Your use of the board is really important as well, isn't it? I must admit, I always felt in a safe place as a language teacher as soon as I was using images. I always felt that an image on the board or through a handheld flashcard, a PowerPoint image or moving images was going to hold attention. And similarly, I would argue that showing text on a screen rather than the printed version in front of them can help in making students look forward, focus on both you and the board. So I think your board use, clarity of writing, use of pictures, even if your artwork is terrible, that can itself be of interest to students as they sort of smile at your stick person drawings or whatever it might be. So these are all kind of generic teacher skills that are really important when it comes to holding students' attention. In general, we're talking about keeping language comprehensible. So, I'm sorry if this seems obvious to you, but, it's a question of pitching your language at or maybe fractionally above the current level of your students' comprehension, keeping it sort of largely comprehensible. So, try and avoid bringing in too many new words or phrases. Modify the input you use with a class, simplify the syntax when you need to, simplify sentences, avoid complex sentences with subordinate clauses that might take too much attention and therefore cause potentially a loss of focused attention. I was watching a presentation the other day by vocabulary researcher Paul Nation, a very famous researcher in the field, who's talking about the importance of controlling the vocabulary, limiting the vocabulary that students are exposed to. And that for us can, if you're teaching a language like French or Spanish, can involve making sure you include cognates or vocabulary that they've encountered before. And I would argue for, on the whole, don't speak at native speaker speed. There might be some cases where you want to teach students to cope with limited amounts of native speaker language just so they're used to it. But on the whole, for us, we're modelling language at a speed that can be focused on and which keeps students' attention. I think as well, if we're talking about holding attention, then allow students to ask questions. Yeah. Teach them some basic phrases. We mentioned eye contact already, but I'd focus on that one in particular, this idea, you've probably heard the phrase, teach to the eyes. I think that's so important, and that's again where your classroom layout might play a role. One interesting thing that came up in some research by Rachel Hawkes in her PhD thesis was the idea of using humour. Of course, we all have different personalities, but you know, humour can reduce anxiety and can produce more engagement. So it might be that your students mimic subconsciously your personality. So if you use humour, it might relax them and make them more likely to use language in a spontaneous way. So if you're relaxed, the class might be relaxed as well. To put it in different terms, to use Stephen Krashen's term, affective filter, the students learn better when their affective filter is lowered. So in other words, when they have less psychological resistance to what's going on, when they're more relaxed about the language lesson and enjoying it more. And I think keeping things comprehensible to maintain attention can mean using translation from time to time. I think it means using gesture, as I've mentioned already, pictures, classroom objects. I think having regular routines actually is really important. That's not arguing that every lesson should be the same and dull and repetitive, but students do like routines. And if they're familiar with the routine, then it's likely they will understand more and maintain attention. Don't forget to use the written word. So if you're doing a listening task, write things up on the board on a regular basis, just to shift the focus. And, there is a case to be made when it's said that teachers sometimes talk too much. I think maybe it can be the case that many teachers naturally, because they're passionate about what they want to teach, can talk for too long. I'm not arguing here against teacher talk, but saying that sometimes you can go on too long, and that we do need as much as possible to allow students to interact with us when we're doing teacher-led work. So, for example, if you're using a PowerPoint, don't let it become a teacher-centered lecture-style lesson. Make sure that somewhere in your sequence of activities you've got a mixture of hands-up work, no hands-up work, pair work, and so on. All that will help students pay attention. Now, just to give you an example of comprehensibility and how you can use that in a sort of organic way, this is actually adapted from a book by Nava and Pedrozzini, a very good book about language teacher education. And I've adapted it from their version, but this is the sort of thing where you can build in repetition and hold attention. So in this case, if you just let me read this one through, it'd be something like this. So we're trying to focus on the word sporty and getting it repeated and into memory whilst holding attention. So teacher says, "Are you sporty?" "I love sport. I'm very sporty. I play football, tennis. I love to go walking." "Do you like sport?" "Hands up if you like sport." "Lionel Messi's sporty, isn't he?" "Harry Kane is sporty." "Who else is sporty?" "Rafael Nadal?" "Yep, he's sporty." "Is Homer Simpson sporty?" "No." "Homer loves sport." "No, he loves donuts." "Is an elephant sporty?" "No." "Is a hippopotamus sporty?" "No." Altogether, sporty, and so on. Now, I've just gone through that to give you an example of the sort of transactional exchange that goes on in a typical language lesson, which is somewhat organic and communicative. It's somewhat playful, and it generates a good amount of listening and hopefully some attention, whilst allowing students to acquire the language in an implicit, natural way. Another way to make sure that your language is comprehensible is by taking the sort of sentence builder, the substitution table approach that many teachers are engaging in at the moment, largely thanks to the work of Gianfranco Conti, which both of us have written about in the book Breaking the Sound Barrier, and the Language Teacher Toolkit book as well. And I think the mere fact that we're using in this sort of substitution table translations here keeps it comprehensible at every stage. So I'm not going to, in this presentation, go into that in detail. It's been dealt with elsewhere. But I think one of the merits of this approach, particularly for students whose attention can wander, and perhaps the relatively less able students, shall we say, this is a great way to help hold attention. So the references there, I mentioned Nava and Pedrazzini, Second Language Acquisition in Action. I mentioned Stephen Krashen, and his Principles and Practice book is available online, just Google search it. I mentioned our book there, Breaking the Sound Barrier, and the Rachel Hawkes PhD thesis, which you can find there. The Schmidt noticing hypothesis is also described on that link. And so, I've been reading about this stuff as part of the work that both Gianfranco and I are doing for our book on cognitive science, which, if all goes well, will come out sometime in 2020. Meanwhile, there are our other two books, The Language Teacher Toolkit and our more recent book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. And do subscribe to the channel if you find this sort of thing interesting, and there'll be more of these sessions to come. Hope to see you again. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.